All right, well, day 11, and I hope it's day 11. It should be day 11. So we are actually going to have a look at introducing guides, and we were left with what I will consider the pedals. Like the wheel is such a simplistic component, so this should be done. The God node is done. The seat we don't care about just yet, and it's such a minor thing that I don't even know if I care to do it. And the frake we might be interested in. So let's get started with it. Something that we were doing the last time is actually getting the God node to have all the outputs that we're interested in. And I should probably use a mouse to dock views because, oh, come on, because the tablet is super sensitive for these things. So we were left where we had the actual output for the God node working fine, I believe. So that's the input for the pedals. We're actually interested in these. And yeah, and it's hierarchized. Then what we were doing was, and somebody was asking about space switching or parent switching, whatever you want to call it, it boils down to the same thing. And that got me thinking that, yeah, it's probably a good time to actually start showing some of that. Now, at the same time, I was looking at what we're doing. I was thinking about it during the stream, but I didn't want to take too long of a tangent, and sort of realized that we're not quite, like, we're calling these an input. And the way we have formalized the idea of input and output is it manages whatever goes on between the components. So if I have a component that's my pedals, everything it needs to receive from the outer world to actually do something should be in the input. Everything that it needs to transmit on to something else, in this case it will be, well, this is the wheel geometry, but you get the idea, or the wheel component, whatever, should be in the output, and nothing more, nothing less than that. Now, we do have something here, which we have done for convenience sake, that is basically a pseudo hierarchy of where we want the offset. So we have the local word of the pedals, and we had to add an underword here to connect our God node. So the output of the, come on, select, the output of the God node from here to the actual input of the pedals. We needed something to basically introduce offsets. And then as I was going through that, I was like, well, this isn't really an input-output kind of case. Because what we're doing here is there's this pseudo hierarchy of going from what will be the word local to our component that's connected as it should be, to where we wish the center of the staves to be, to where we think the pedals will be. Now, something that is kind of interesting, I guess, is the pedals are only really interested in having a local word. And this stuff we're using for the sake of convenience to guide where things will be. Or rather to place things, which is exactly what guides tend to be for. So what we should be doing is we do keep these as our input, and it's going to be our local word, and we don't care for anything more than that, but we also want to get this stuff and make it part of an actual guide so that we can start guiding stuff. To introduce guides, I'm actually going to jump back and do it from the God node. So guides you can think of, well, the way I do them, and to guide like really complex components, you sort of need a pipeline built around it, at least to some extent. But guides are sort of a meter rig, they're rigging the rig, and if you have a clean enough I/O and you have things like buffers in the right places, and you don't overdo things like inheritance and hierarchies and stuff like that, they're pretty easy to build. So all we want to do, and again, if we were pipelining and making this prettier, these will probably not be quite this simplistic. But if we say in the same vein where we have an output, a control, we don't really have an input, if we get ourselves something that we call a guide, what we need to place something like this. So for the God node, let's say that we establish some of our boundaries. So we establish some of the rules, we spec the component, and we decide, and you can do it on paper, UML, whatever you want. But we decide that it has no input, and that as far as the output goes, it might actually need to provide multiple spaces, because that's what it's about, to other components. And in a way, this is kind of wrong, because we're providing these localized, but we can delocalize them later, or we can use their word space. So I'm going to leave them like that for convenience. But the interesting part about it is that if we look at what the internals are, we could say that our spec is, we're going to have a sequence of controls. And each of these is going to have an offset, which is going to be right under the control, so we don't care for the offset much. And that each of these can only be translated, it can be rotated, and that is, not necessarily going to be great for a God node. It depends on what contract you want to establish. But for the sake of simplicity, because I don't want to spend hours on it, I'd like to cover quite a bit of ground today. We could say that if you look at the internal parameters of what these God node could actually be, you're gonna have a hierarchy of 3 elements that we care about. And what did we call them here? We use the master, com, and end. So we're gonna have master, com, and the end of something, and the only change between these, like the only parametric change between these, is a vertical offset. So it's a height difference between these, which means that this whole thing internally is actually defined by 2 parameters, and we could call them h1 and h2. So the guide is sort of an internal configuration, and you could choose to make it a pass-through. We'll probably do that for the sake of simplicity. And as far as component rules that we've talked about, we were saying, the output of a component is the only thing that can go to the input of another component. We could also establish that we have a set of parameters that is going to be our guide, and that we actually do allow, so don't care about that, that we actually do allow pass-through of the guides or the output to go into other guides. So this would be the guide output, and we might say, okay, the guide output actually has to be the same as the guide input. We're not allowed to change it, or we might decide that the actual live parameters go out. In this case, if the guide output affects these parameters, I will say we do want it changed. So we're now saying that the guide is also a viable output, and that can possibly only go in guide. We'll see. Start with simple rules, enforce them. If you find that they limit you, then expand that rule set, but don't start right away trying to think of everything and everything else. And we might even say that this is a software interface, and that these connections between items, they don't need to necessarily be this simplistic. You could actually have software edges where for our inputs in the components, we could even say, okay, there's actually a sequence to my input interface for a given component where the input is always the first in the stream, and then the guide is a little bit fuzzier. It can receive from other guides, and it can also receive from the input, so that we don't have too many duplicates. But these contracts can be broken. We can't go from the guide to the input or stuff like that. And maybe we can even allow something like that, because that way you get to see the difference between a guide in action and the parameter of a guide. Hopefully that makes sense. If there are any questions, ask them now, and I'll catch up as we go through these. How you want to actually offer the guide, you could actually offer parameters. Depends on how you want to pipeline it mostly. You could offer controls, and you could implement callbacks to actually make it do things. You could tie them to the build scripts. For now, we're going to do the simplest thing possible. For the record, not fond of this way of doing things, as in using locators in general, but we're going to make do for now. We say we have 2 parameters. So what we're interested in, and we also establish here, we're okay with the input actually funneling into the guide. And we're probably going to be okay, because at this point we're inside the edges. We're okay with the guide going to the output as well if we need to transmit things or passing through or whatever. Space switching made for a less readable animation graph. Does using guide negate that? No, in this case they're 2 completely separate things. Space switching we'll get to in a little bit, but first I'd actually like to show guidable components so that we have a better case for having multiple spaces. And we said we need 2 parameters. Do I have? No, I still don't have that shortcut. I need to look at why I lost my parenting shortcut. And we are saying that we don't have a central word here. So everything is going to be word related for the guide. Might be a good idea, might not be a good idea. Tempted to say probably not a great idea the way we're working right now. So no parenting. So let's say that we actually do say that we have a first component, and this is going to be for a word, it's going to be our actually let's do it something like that. Not a great naming convention, but it will do for now. So, and the reason I'm doing guide word control and not word guide control or something like that is that, remember, when we're talking about naming conventions, these makes it possible for us to actually, come on, this makes it possible for us to look at something from the edges in words, which is more reliable than having to split things that might have an arbitrary number of separators in them. So the last one was end control. Now that we have something like that, I'm gonna catch up to the questions. Please do keep asking them. Now that we have something like that, we have something that we can basically set these items by, and let me also match these things so that we don't get jumps. So we want that, matching that, match transforms, and we want that one, come on, matching that one. And if you don't know, this comes from XSI. You can know for like 2 or 3 versions, you can middle click menus and it will run the last command that you had actually run. So we have 1, 2, and 3 transforms. Now, because we use buffering the way we do, and because these buffers do nothing but establish the actual space of the items that we want to work with, we're in a pretty good place to guide this thing by simply connecting these to the buffer, to the various buffers. Now let me get rid of these. And if you want to get fancy, you could add an attribute like guide visible, and you make the controls unselectable when the guide is visible, and the actual guidable controls visible and selectable, and vice versa. That way you can toggle on and off your configuration mode of sorts. So the other bit that we're interested in is connecting these 3 buffers, and that's going to represent our guide input. And we do have master, com, and author ones. They actually came in a decent spot, and calling things slightly different here because these would actually get connected to the word. We don't really care, like we care about things explaining what they do. We don't care about names matching if they actually they might be related because we're connecting them, but they're not necessarily related one-to-one as data goes. So, space switching made for a less readable animation graph. They're using it negate that. That was the one from before. Space switching does make for a less readable animation graph, so there's a number of tools that you normally build around space switching to either do a mix down, so you bake things as you change space so that people can only always kind of use one, but transfer is automated for them, or sometimes like you keep track of the offsets, which can get really tricky. So it's always a trade-off, and you gotta figure out with the animators what they are willing to trade off for what. Like great features and complexity and all of that, like they can get tricky to implement, so how much time you actually have to do these things has a great deal of effect on what you can actually do with it. So mix down is probably the easiest thing. Like whenever you space switch, you mix down everything that was connected to that space, which can add a lot of keyframes unless you do some sort of smart bake, which is, I always thought it's not too hard to write, but a lot of people find it challenging. So now buffer wise, we have something interesting where we need to do the usual, do we need to? So because these can actually offset the buffer underneath, we have master offset, and this is the default space. Now we can connect directly, I reckon. It should be viable for guiding, because a guide stage, like you're guiding the rig in its default configuration. So it should be alright to do something like that. If you had more complex situations, you might need a more complex guide. If you would rather blend spaces instead of switching, does Maya have any RBF type nodes? Yeah, You know, it's a good question. They added an RBF. For those that don't know, RBF is a radial basis function, and it's something that you can do to fluidly mix between things that normally don't have a clear linear interpolation between them. Rotations are, and complex transforms are a classic case. I don't know if you can use those RBF nodes. I think they're mostly meant for the PSD shape solver. I don't know if you can use them with vanilla transforms. It's possible. You would have to look for that. Now, the thing with blend is that I've always done, it's actually not that hard if you decouple transforms properly, as in within the transform itself. But I find that every time we do it, even if we do it really well, animators just seem to not like it, and I don't know why. So I have snapping on, don't I? And oh, I also turn off one of my interfaces. So don't care about the shelves, but do care about, and I also forget where the hell that is. Toolbox? No? Have I minimized something? Another one. Come on. Attribute editor to settings. I am lost. I don't remember what the name of the settings is. Command line, range slider, status line. Oh, I thought it was toolbox, but it's not. No, it's definitely not the toolbox actually. Should probably just use the views. You want the status? Oh, yeah, sorry. This is the messages, and that's, yeah, it's the opposite. Thank you. Like the status line is how you set the status of your tools, basically. And in XSI, the status is actually this, and it still trips me. Like this is messages or error messages or something like that. Helpline, which is of no help at all. I mean, there's no real help here. Anyway, thank you. So turn that one off and rewire brain for the right shortcuts. Now, what we have here is that we are now literally guiding the defaults of that rig. Now, that has a trickle-down effect on all the components that are connected, which, if you ask me, is desirable. It also, and if you remember, I had to jump for a couple hoops to then realize that I had a static offset that I was using here. And it took me a little bit to actually come around and go like, oh yeah, that's just a static value. And I had no way of knowing that static value from this. I would have to punch it in numerically because all of these controls could be moved, which means I had nothing in the scene that would tell me what that offset was. Now I do have that something in the sim because I am stating that the default of my rig is going to be relying on these items. So hopefully this makes sense, and this is literally how simple it actually is to guide something. Our rig might actually still be scalable. Yeah, we haven't hooked up the scale for the geometry, but I think the rig in general still is. Scalable rigs can be tricky, but they can be achieved, for the record, even including negative scaling, which is not as bad as people make it up to be, because people make it up to be impossible, but it's still very, very painful. So, moving on. Again, if you have questions, please do feel free to ask them. Now, all of these simple guide here was because what I wanted to get to is that if you look at the input for the pedals, like what these are really doing, they're actually guiding the offsets that I'm using within the components, but they don't come from outside, so they're not, by our definition of an input, an actual input. So what we're gonna do is actually, well, let's move the, what are we doing here? After control? Sure, let's do it after control. After the 4, nah. Okay, so what we're doing here is actually establishing a guide. Now, we are actually interested in these being the input, and we do care for that, but we are not really interested in having these in there. So these should, ooh, infinite connections. Let's see what happens if I go for 1. Okay, that's not doing any, oh, that's great, actually. So, yep. So I'm relying on the hierarchy enough from inside the controls that I'm basically starting everything from the staves. which is good. That makes our life a good deal easier. So we do have our guide. We don't care for it in the graph. We probably want to move back to the pedals to sort this one out. We do want, and this is, you know, these are the static offsets, which is what made me think of like going back to the guides. Now we do care for that to be where it is, and that should have no upstream dependencies. That is very good. So what we want to do is we should be able to just straight up move these to the guide layer and basically respect all of our promises. Now what we want in the actual input is we do want to add an input, which is going to be, where is it? What have I done? Have I moved the entire input, haven't I? No. Oh, I grouped the input. So get the actual added transform in here, and that is going to be our local word. So pedalsam local word srt. Now these change to basically be we can use the name of the component. You cannot use it and rely on the DAG if you establish that your guide is only going to be made of DAG nodes. It's like, remember, your naming conventions don't need to be too rigid. They just need to be viable. So these become controls now by our previous standards. And what we do is we basically add the guide as a lead token to the warble. I hope this is making sense for people. Let me know if it's not. Otherwise, I'm happily going to continue down this path. And now that we do have that, what we actually want to do is, this is our, for real now, local word. This is the local word that in a hierarchy affects the rest. And we are promising that these are going to stay in word space, so we can do a straight up connection for these. Exercise way of handling scaling, almost convinced. Sorry. Yeah, XSI for transforms. XSI had classical scaling, which is very similar to Maya, which is what you use in Softimage 3D. That seems like a lifetime ago. Actually, it is kind of a lifetime ago because I'm working with people that were born after XSI was introduced and Softimage 3D discontinued. And then they had the XSI way of scaling, which is a really somewhat offbeat but pretty interesting way of multiplying transforms that got you... Scaling didn't make mathematical sense if you turn it on, but it made a lot of interaction sense. I'm still undecided whether I will want something like that in Maya or not. It is a dangerous thing to rely on if you don't know what you're doing and what it's doing under the hood. So we have now moved properly to having local word. Now, was I connecting? That is the question. Was I connecting any of what were these? So this is the word which is not connected. Was I connecting these to the outside? Does not seem like I was, which is great. So I was introducing an offset here, which is, what am I doing here? This looks like, oh, okay, that's, yeah, the IK follows something else. So this in actuality is something like that. Now we're in pretty good place now. So we didn't have a really strong contract for the input and output of this stuff. I will need to check how exactly this was following the God node. So pedals input. So if I move these, that works, that works. Okay. So now what I want to do is honor this contract. And so let's make sure we don't have silly things. So this is our pedals guide local word. Oh yeah, because we connected the guide, so we're good. And this is the part that we could very easily refactor now. I'm not sure I will, we'll see. So let's see if we re-established everything the right way. That's cool. So now we actually do have, I believe, ourselves a proper guide. So you can, if you got another geometry, now we have the geometry and you see it, move it, which might be confusing, but You could actually configure your rig parts and everything will be in the right places. It will be going down the chain as you would expect it to do. And that's pretty much all there is to a simple transformation based guide. And if I actually added null shapes or some other shapes to these items, if I needed some offset between where the God node is and where I actually want the pivot of the staves, you know, that will be what you move, and place the pedals wherever you want them. That's it. So hopefully this makes sense. It's literally all we needed to do. Now, here is what might be the interesting part. Do we care? Now, this wheel thing is pretty simple. So we don't care for that. The pedals are fine as they are. We probably want to work on the God node. Now, what happened here is that I was actually introducing this offset, which was the one between this item and where I start things from manually. So that was -16. Actually, sorry, I was introducing the offset between these and the word manually, because what was happening was that we expected everything in our pedals component to actually always come from the word center. Did you freeze transforms on the guides? No, I didn't, and honestly I wouldn't, because I actually want to see these offsets. If you freeze the transforms, you're going to affect the pivots, and I don't want that. The guide is something that should probably be deleted once the actual rig goes out, like before the rig goes out to animation. But I want to see what these offsets are. I want to be able, like, a good guide is something that you can move in space and you don't do damage, right? So what we have now is, am I actually affecting the comp properly? Yes, I am. That's cool. So, but that's up to you. I mean, you could actually buffer the guide controls. Are they mostly for the creation time of the rig? It's let's say that you do reusable components, which is a big part of why you would want to do components instead of just baking together a single rig that's, you know, one conflated hierarchy, which if you're in a hurry, to be honest, is perfectly fine. If you do reusable components, I would expect to go, okay, I need a God node and I need to connect it to something else like a character. I want to bring in a God node that's guidable, so that I bring this in as a Maya scene, as a model with my own tools, whatever, and I just move stuff around where I need it. Then I bring in another component like the pedals. And these, you know, I am going to have the output from the God node. I'm going to bring in pedals from somewhere else, or a spine, or whatever needs to be attached to the God node. And all I want to do is connect this stuff. Now, the other part that I think we've just done ourselves a favor with is that we were operating under the assumption that we're word to word. So what we actually want, and this is something that, and that's why I've chosen to do guides, because this is, it makes it easy to show these things. These really doesn't belong all that much to the underworld, and as I was, and this is why I was struggling with it, I'm normally used to transmitting static offsets through so that the things are configurable. But I just do not like to have these, like, this is a magic number. This is a number that you have to know exists, and you have to know the value, and as you tweak things, you have to tweak them by hand. So, and you can see the result, because if I do something like this is not changing, it's not placing things where I actually want them. But we say that this is actually going to be equivalent to the distance between, what were we saying? So we're going from here and we want to reach the word, which makes it, now this is static value. So if I want this offset in there, and we establish in our contract that we are okay passing the guides along as parts of our connection, I don't need all of this stuff any longer to place the word like that. I can actually, at least in the underword for now, which is what we're gonna do, get the inverse of the word matrix if I have this right. Let's see if this fails clamorously or if it actually works out right. And again, you know, if it was more than just translations, you might have to run slightly trickier operations than that. What have I done there? Am I running the, no, I said the inverse and I picked the word matrix. So what happens now is that before, like, and with before, I actually mean seconds ago, if I was moving this, then I would have had to adjust that magic number. Now that's still messed up because I'm moving this. That is interesting, actually. I had not thought of that. Oh yeah, I don't want to move that, actually. I'm stupid. So if I move this, now that offset in there is actually dynamic, but it's part of the guide, which is why you actually want to delete them before you send them out. Unless you want to, and this, in a way, this is how you do dynamic pivots. If you left it in and you put them in some secret mode, or you give people tool to manage them, you just got dynamic pivots the way I don't use them inside of Maya. They're more explicit this way. They're also probably slightly more expensive, but hopefully you get the idea. Which is faster to evaluate, the DAG node, buffer, or storing the map for freeze transforms? It will depend. So when you say storing the map for freeze transforms, I imagine you mean freezing. Yeah, freezing the transform would introduce a pivot offset. I would imagine that Maya, when it does its own magic internally to the transform node to get the final matrices out, it probably has an easier time getting that internal piece of data and running the operation then it will have like fetching stuff from all over the graph. Now, when it comes to parallelism, the more split the stuff is, the more entry point taxes you pay, but the more chances for parallelism you actually get, because things decouple sooner. So it's something that I'm going to get into season 1, where we're going to start on graph theory and performance. That might be worth doing. For now, not just yet. Now, hopefully this makes sense. And that's pretty much it. That's all you need to do to get a guide. Now, the interesting part here. So we're coming from the end here and we're multiplying by that. Now, what if, instead of having these in a hierarchy as they are, we actually put them in word space? We will not have to reverse all this stuff. Right, so actually, no, we will still have to reverse it, so it doesn't matter. But what we could do is choose to get all of these, and this is up to you. This is entirely up to you and how you manage things. Run all of these operations and go, okay, because of the way hierarchies work and all of that, we could choose to flatten it and have the offsets baked into the component so that the component outputs 3 different center of the word kind of spaces for you to switch. It will sometimes simplify your life. Most of the time I don't like it. I'd rather have more information and do a little bit more work inside the components to actually compensate for what I need. So, all of these to say that in the input here, we said, okay, we only care about these. And these offsets are guide. That's correct. We're respecting your contracts and all of that. But now I want to be able to offset between multiple spaces. And these need to be all put in here so that this part of my guide or other bits is pretty easy to manage. And this is the stuff that we had in the underworld. I would rather, if you want parent switching or space switching, whatever you want to call it, that needs to be internal to the component. Right now it's in the underworld, and chances are parent switching, if you're the animator, you want to control from the pedals component. You want to switch that. You don't want to switch something here, which basically requires you go back to the God node. So we are on a mission to fix that. And that means that we want to bring this underworld inside the pedals component, which in time means that this needs to basically translate to something that is usable for the components right away. Now, this might require we jump a few things. We said that, and let's see what this goes out to actually. This should only go out to the guide, and then the guide should be doing work. So another thing to be careful with when it comes to the guide is that if you have connections, like important connections like this one where the guide receives the input and informs the component, if you delete the guide, you have to know the pairings of plugs to reconnect these things properly. Now, I should be able to respect my contract literally if I sever these and these. So, and this is why, this is the part where I actually like nodes. And I like having strong boundaries in my components. It makes it pretty easy to see if you're breaking contract or not. So I want this end SRT, and I want multiple spaces. So that's going to be my local word. And maybe I want an offset word. So not a great name, not fond of it, but we got to move on. And thinking of good names takes a long time. Or end word, end of the word, whatever. It's all academical at this point. So if I grab right away the master space, that should be where I want this. So I should be able to establish, and this is an output, I should be able to establish a straight up connection and be done with this. So this is the pedals, this is the master SRT, and everything. I would expect it, at least. We'll see if that stands true. I would expect these to work just fine. So this is one of my two spaces, and it's the one we were using before. So I would expect that if I do that, that works great. Now, what is happening here is that I am now obeying the master space, which we've defined as this one. So I'm not receiving from these any longer, which might or might not be a great idea, might or might not work for us. And I probably need to fix rotations and stuff like that, because I was using, let's have a look. So is this receiving everything? So master offset. Let's have a look. Let's have a super quick look. See, this is not receiving everything that we would expect it to receive. That is curious. So, okay. Oh, that's just my manipulator not being in the right settings, is it? Yep. That will do it. So careful if you use the manipulator as a diagnostic tool. Remember that you need to be in the right space for it to work. So that is working as I would expect it to. That is working as I would expect it to. That is okay. It probably means that we are doing something silly, like we're accounting for some word rotation instead of local rotation. We don't care about that yet. We'll fix it later. Thank you. Some kind soul actually reminded me to save. So let's go for that. Okay, now let's ignore that rotation for a bit. We can fix that later. But what we want to do is, okay, now we have this one, and that's fine. That should be working fine. Now all of our inputs are coming from these words. So this end of word, we do want to receive what we were getting before from this. So this is word SRT, so it's fine to, this is the guide. I will say that this is fine to have in the underword actually, because we respect all of our promises, and this is just how we decide to connect things. Simplifies our lives a little bit. So there's two ways you could go about this basically, which is you could have multiple inputs offset, and then you could bring these in and decide to blend between those. So you have a more complex blend inside. Or very likely you are gonna go and get these two spaces, or more than just those two, for in, you know, offset to the word space more than once for several inputs. In that case, move them to the underword, whatever gets you the least repetition. So this is probably going to be fine, and that means that we now have a second parent space, which is good. So we have the two we care about. We are... we did not call this underword, despite the fact it is. Oh, come on. That correct? Should be. By the way, if you don't know, namespaces are literally just names. So if you rename something and you append the namespace with colon or several nested namespaces, if that namespace exists, otherwise you get an error, it will just put it in that namespace. That's literally all namespaces are. So now what we have is that we have two items that are in word space, and if we want, and they're pre-transformed, so whatever we do with these should actually, and this is where you probably want diagnostic objects to sort, should actually get us something, a starting point that is the same of what we had before. But it will obey other transforms and it should actually respect the law. So, yep. So that is how we expect it, which is great. Now, if you wanted to just change the space of something, this is basically what you will be doing. And we're working in word space, so it is now basically under a different parent. Now, if you want to blend between the two, if everything, and this is why I centralized the spaces to one word, I also realized I just basically cheated myself out of using callbacks because I have everything word lined. So, I've made things too simple, if there is such a thing. But okay, let's do. You could use a constraint if you want many spaces. Otherwise, if you only have two, you can simply go blend, rotation, or whatever the various nodes are. Unblend, I think they all start with. Unblend. DA is for double angle. I don't remember if it's double angle. Is it a additive rotation? So this is another node, factory Maya node that came in for layers originally, that I actually quite like. It's pretty reliable, it's pretty stable, you have the option for different accumulation modes. I like it. As far as I'm concerned, this is one of those where you go, yeah, yep, this is a successful node, this is what I want from a node. So, oh man, I almost resent that we made things so simple. If this was production, I'd be pretty happy that I did. This not being a production, not so much. So unblend node additive, that is just yeah, that's duals. Anybody remembers which one is for multiple positions for triplets? Float A, 1632, rotation, scale, boolean. So scale, really? Scale 1. Oh, okay, this is because you can have different accumulation modes. Blend colors, yeah, blend colors is one that comes from the shading sets. I was hoping there will be, and this takes quadruplets, I believe, because you can feed it the alpha, though it's hidden. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I was hoping for one that actually takes k distance, which is what these are, but it should, like, it doesn't, k distance to float does not pop conversion nodes. So we're going in this order. And I remember there being one, but again, when it comes to Maya default nodes, like, don't take my word for it. I've worked in Happy Custom Word for long enough that a lot of my knowledge is outdated. I review the factory nodes every once in a while when I have time. But so now all of these are inside the edges of my component, which is good, which means we could actually and if we have only two spaces, it's pretty easy to do a blend instead of a Boolean switch. I should be able to just add an attribute here and call it, where do we go? We're doing something like word to seat blend, float. Remember that unless you give it a minimum and maximum, and normally that's soft min and soft max is all you need, you will not get a UI slider. At least that I know of. So we do have what we want in there. We do not care for the shapes. And we should, come on, word to seat blend. So Blender. I love how they all have different names. We should now, and that's a scale, so it doesn't really do as much. Then that is, sorry, no, that's the translation, so it should actually do something. Let's see what we are doing there. we should actually be able to do nothing yet. Yes, because I haven't connected crap. So we say we're going from the guide out, which is all right. We should be cool with that. Output. Let's not make the usual mistake. So that's cool. Then output for the rotation should get us the rotation, not surprisingly, and output for the scale for the scale. Now that basically means that it should now blend. Will it blend? Come on. So something is off with these. And that's the thing, like the blend scale might. So we'll need to look at that as well. And that gets the rotation. I think we do have some oddities in how we're transmitting things. So we have local word, we have these two, and these should hook internally to all three of our blend nodes. So anybody at a glance in chat can spot an obvious defect before I start debugging these? So clearly something is going wrong with these. It might even be that these transforms are not where I would expect them to be, or the offset that we were using is getting invalidated. That might be more likely, actually. So let's have a look at that. But I think it's going to be something like that. I think we're overestimated what we can do with the offset. Oh. All right. So what is going on is that it's actually going to the right place. It's not blending the rotation, which is, oh yes, okay. I'm stupid. It's very, very simple. We simply, because I was in a hurry, so all I did was connect these to the blenders that have 0 to 1. This actually needs the weights. Okay, that makes sense. Well, we can live with that. So if we're saying that at 1 we're on the other end, we want these on weight B, and then we will want, because of the way these are multiple weights, where is it? Can I see the weights in here? Yeah. The other weight has to be reciprocal, which is usually just add double linear. So I should be able to do 1 minus and get the reciprocal I need. Yeah, 1 minus that, same thing. Whether like, it's absolutely irrelevant whether it's like, oh, subtraction is commutative. So something minus 1. Why I'm stupid? No, it's absolutely not. What am I saying today? So I want the negation of that. We'll revert. Oh, so like revert on floats. Reverse on floats is, somebody was saying, is actually gonna do 1 minus. Let's see if that is true. We might finally have a use for that. And because yeah, otherwise I would have to use a multiply to negate and do 1 minus that one. So as I said, that's the input, and that's okay. I don't get a vision of the output, do I? We'll have to connect it to know. Do people have bets? Will this work? Will it blend? And wait a. So let's have a look, and we will know if it blends. That is a terrible joke, and I'm ashamed to admit that it was actually intentional. I have used reverse like that before. Yeah, I'm getting slightly different results depending on the type, which could either be cool if you're aware of all the quirks or bite you very hard in the ass later on. So Okay, that is working out. Now, the bit that doesn't make sense still is why is this not getting rotated the way I want it to? So accumulation mode by component. We don't care about the accumulation in this case. This is not what I would expect. It's like not blending my rotation. So unless I'm doing something stupid, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Bilayer, oh, this will be bilayer blend? Shouldn't be. So blend colors blends between color 1 and color 2 when blender is 1, the output is color 2. Okay, Ryan is making a point that my translate and scale are not blending the way I expect. I would say that translate and scale are actually doing exactly what I expect them, but no, he appears to be right. Oh, it was countering you, wasn't it? Anyway. So let's have a look at what we can do. Okay, we sorted out the rotation. That's great news. Now, are there multiple modes to these? Render pass mode. Don't care about a render pass mode. So you are saying that I should invert basically. So Blender 1, it's this is why I don't like using the shader nodes. Just not my thing. So we also now apparently have a cycle, which I will dubbed that as have a look. This is so unexciting, but we do have a cycle somewhere, which is pretty interesting. So this is the settings for the pedals, which are going to the blender, which should be okay. Oh, sure. Yeah, that will be a cycle. All right. Yeah, Ryan appears to be right in this case. Now we do have an issue with rotations. Do we fix it or not? We'll see. That means that we want to do the same silly thing. I could actually just have connected the other, the reverted weight, and do we do that? Do we keep things? Yeah, let's do that. So it seems somewhat cleaner to do it that way. So we restore the original order. This is in the original order. We do dump this one in there. See, this is the kind of stuff that always takes longer than you will want with modeling. Unless you really know what all the actual nodes do, which I don't for a lot of Maya nodes, not ashamed to admit it, you will have to figure stuff out, especially if you have expectations. And I do have expectations. They're sometimes being met, to be absolutely fair, but not all the time. So, does that put us in a decent position to do something more interesting? So we're good with that. All right. Now, we do have one bit somewhere left that is, so this is good. As I said, I might have made it too simple. If you wanted more than one space, then what you would have to do is basically sequence multiples of these sets of nodes, and it gets a little bit trickier because you have to renormalize the weights yourself, because as you sequence, they basically literally get layered, whereas the weights, as people are used to in Maya, like you get on constraints, are actually normalized weights out of a single set. So you could either use a constraint as a blending node, which will not necessarily be, like, constraints are embed per se, especially if you're already going out to a transform anyway. You could like literally repurpose a constraint node to be a transform blend, and you'll be perfectly fine. My issue with constraints is how they come into the word in a default C. So yes, it does put us in a good position to save. Thank you. All right, so we're good with that. I am on the fence on whether I want to fix that rotation issue or not. I do feel that we should, because it doesn't feel proper to have it. So, decisions. Something is going wrong somewhere, but it shouldn't take too long to fix it. So something was probably relying on an offset that is now not valid any longer. So this is just our settings, we don't care. It might even be, because this is fine. So it's the pedals that are clearly receiving something wrong. And these are our left and right. So the staves are at issue. Let's have a quick look. I give it 1 minute, nah, 2 minutes, and we'll see. So I'm localizing that, getting from the buffer, control, pedals IK control. So let me, super quick, let's check. Is it just the FK? Or is it just the IK? So the FK is fine, the IK is wrong. Yeah, okay, that makes it easy to find what it is. So pedal buffer, probably receiving from something wrong. Okay, I might know what it is. So we're looking at the angle between axes, and now we're changing that assumption as we go up and down the hierarchy, which is not necessarily going to be good for us. Yeah. So right, I'm not gonna then blend node additive rotation lets you blend using quaternion slurp under the hood. Yes. So let me catch up. All right, the question was, there's a good question in chat, which is why not use a blend color for the rotation as well? Well, you know, I just don't like to use shader nodes. I find that I know less about what goes on inside those than anything else. My types get more confusing. Now they're also gonna get you floats. So if you were to connect straight up to the rotation, you don't get the angles, which means I would assume, let's try it, that you get unique conversion nodes, yep, up to wazoo, and your graph teleported into hell for you. See, now I don't even know what happened any longer. That's why I don't like them in first place. Cool. But even more than that, beside the stray unit, wow, those unit conversion nodes is like, if you dare having anything pinned by mistake, or in that case it wasn't even pinned. Anyway, so that alone is reason enough. The other thing is that, as it's been mentioned, the anim blend node is actually is it? Yeah, this is the additive rotation, is pretty good in how it lets you choose how you want to manage the layers. So if you need to chain several of these, they actually play pretty nice, because that's what layers have to deal with. And then internally you can choose if you want a Euler or quaternion slurp. If you're word to word, a Euler will usually work pretty well. If you're crossing odd spaces, like you're doing a lot of back and forth, quaternion will take the shortest path, which might or might not be what you want. So it's vastly better than having a numerical blend between rotations. Like this is how you do rotations. Blending rotations is not the same as blending a single vector. And lastly, you can also tell it what rotation order to deal with, which you definitely will not be able to do with a blend color. So yeah, they're vastly preferable. Yeah, okay, there's a joke that I cannot replicate, but yeah. Unit conversion can, yeah, it spreads very quickly. Anyway, so I twaddled about a lot more than I wanted to on that stuff. So this is what I was doing. Now, as I was saying, there's a thing that actually, and somebody before in chat was saying, oh, that's a bad thing, callbacks. Nah, callbacks in my are actually pretty good. So space switching wise, because I've made my life too easy, because I have made both things operate in word space. If somebody wants to switch between the spaces, if we were at default, so I should probably also hide away the guide. Like if you're not working with the guide, hide it, because otherwise at some point you'll move it and you will do yourself untold damage. You will find out much later on, as soon as you're off center, that you did something very, very stupid. So did I ever add the space? Yeah, I did add the space switch, didn't I? I should have had. So, and word settings. Let's keep ourselves a tab for that. So we do basically have a blend in this case that works just fine for both spaces, and we don't need to do anything fancy. But if we had a discrepancy of sorts in it, and we didn't want a lot of nodes, so we wanted a single node to actually, like, we wanted a constant to update for that offset, or if we want to do something where upon operating one of these transforms, we do something to the other, or we move some item around, we could do that. Now, I'm trying to think if there's a good example I can actually show for these. I should have wired these differently. I should have wired it more haphazardly. Tell you what, I promise I would have done callbacks. We actually got the guide and this part working fine as is. This is unexpected. I was expecting more failures to take care of with callbacks. We will show it with a simpler scene. So, do we? Because the thing is, we haven't added anything to move the freaking lot around, do we? We're not respecting the translation, so we're just doing rotation with these, which means I would have to add something else. Yeah. All right, let's do it with a simple scene. Yeah, I think I saved, but so let's do it with a simple scene and show a little bit. I did hide the shelves as well, didn't I? Yeah. And show a little bit of what I wanted to go over for callbacks. And this is actually going to be a relatively alright example. So what we've done insofar, what we've done insofar is all graph based, right? So everything is pretty much live linked all the time. Now, yeah, we're gonna keep the silly shapes. Where am I? Yeah, it's cool. So everything we have done insofar has been live graphing, and what that means is that if in parent switching often is a context operation. If we have something like this, and this is in a group somewhere, and this was to drive that. Oh, come on. I can do it. Oh, yeah. Of course, I expanded them in a different order, so the ports are in a different order. Now, I'm sort of in trouble in a way. So if I wanted that kind of link, I could establish it like that. If I wanted it to be, not relative to the parent, if I wanted it to be constraint-like, I could just do one of the matrix modes that we've done insofar, and we will be fine. But that's not what we want in this case. Let's say that these are both controls that an animator is using, and you want one control to match the other when something happens. And you always want it to go in both directions, which is where it can get pretty tricky. Now, at evaluation time, you cannot have these connections going this way and those going that way. It's a cycle and it's a pretty nasty one. It's just not gonna do it. It might ping pong your objects into infinite. It might get them to reduce to zero. Like cycles like that are just not manageable in Maya. So there is an alternative to that, which is using callbacks. And you have two ways to interact statically with Maya. One is script jobs, which I absolutely hate, and I will never use them. But script jobs are very much like the kid in the backseat that keeps asking, "Are we there yet?" They're that annoying. So script jobs you can implement to have something on selection. Like in example, I could implement one that says, when I select these, keep an eye on that one, and on move, when I move these after I've selected it, if I set a flag somewhere, then move that one. But the way the script job works is that it tracks on selection, and then you will need to know the name of that object at all times. So inside the script job, you would have to go, if name is this, then do that. And the script job always runs. Whatever you select, it always runs. So if your number of objects or your conditions or stuff like that are, there's enough of them, you are in dire straits. Now, callbacks are the opposite of that. Callbacks are fired off on specific nodes. From a coding perspective, callbacks are interesting. Nasty, threaded pipe, and a nasty to data-driven pipe. So they're called callbacks, but they're not the callbacks you're talking about, basically. The thing about callbacks is that they don't work at evaluation time. They work when you're interacting with the graph, so there's no real threading. There's the main event loop running in Maya, and they basically get fired off by objects. Every object has a set of callbacks that you can implement, and when Maya gets to that object, and only to that object, so it will not always on every selection run things, it will look for callbacks implemented, and if that callback is implemented, it will fire it off. Now, let me actually show what I'm talking about. So, by the way, if you don't know it, this is Charcoal Editor, which replaces Maya Script Editor. If you're gonna do, normally I will use an IDE of sorts to do most of the scripting, but if you're doing quick tests in Maya or stuff like that, I don't think you can actually use Maya without Charcoal Editor if you're doing anything more than a handful of lines. I think it's $65. It's gonna be some of the $65 best spent you've ever done. So I'm gonna use OM2. I refuse to use anything that is not commands in query mode only or AM2. This is not gonna be super beginner friendly probably, but it's just to let you know that this thing exists. So the first thing I want to do here is, and yes, it has auto completion, which is one of the great reasons to use it. So what I'm doing here is just something to get the selection, and if there's none, we don't operate on it. And so, that's going on here. I guess we might as well do a little bit of these two. Let me get my tablet out of the way. This is just the module you want for OpenMaya 2. Is the text readable? Is the size of the text readable enough for you guys at this size? Hope so. Let's make it, we can make it a little bit bigger, can we? We should be able to. Okay. Oh, the one here uses the... show the preferences for it. What am I looking at? Text editors. Yeah. Okay. Keyword color is festering. Fine for me, but it's high res, make it before. Yeah, bigger than this, and I can't type anything in a given window. So anyway, what I'm doing here is literally just getting the selection, setting something to none. Then if the selection exists, get the first M object, which is a pointer to that object, and then working on from there. So if this is not on, so the first thing you need to do with callbacks is very quickly get yourself a way to turn them off. Because if you register the wrong thing, it is going to spam you pretty hard. Now, there's Maya's API is based on attaching functors to pointers, which to be honest I quite like. So you have function sets, you have objects like these. We'll see how far we can go. I only have like less than 20 minutes. And if you want to do something with it, depending on what functionalities you want to attach to it, you will get yourself a function set. So I have the documentation on my right screen, so if you occasionally see me glancing that way, that is why. Now that basically gives you all kinds of silly things that you can do, from, you know, whatever, full name. So yeah, if you need to, let's make these one bigger. So if you need to get the name of something, that's how you do it. If you were to print just mob, which is my short for M object, that will literally tell you this is an M object, which is just a pointer somewhere in memory pretty much. So all Maya knows at that point is this object exists, but it has no functionality attached to it. So if we wanted to tie something to any of those plugs, we first wanted to get the M plugs for those. So let's start working with just the translation on the X, and let's see, what is it? Find plug. These you can use aliases. Not a huge fan, but it's quick and dirty enough for these. Second flag is to know if connected or not. We don't care whether it's connected or not, so you pass false. Then what you want to do is for each callback in, what is it, a message should catch all of them. Yeah. Sorry, trying to think about what I need to type as I go. Now, this is basically a static method that will tell you every callback that exists in that. So whenever you register one, it will tell you, okay, there's a callback here. In this case, we haven't registered anything. But what you want to do is, oh, come on. A message, there should be remove callback for each ID. Otherwise, you have remove callbacks, which takes an array of ID. And each callback here is going to be an ID, and it's just an int. So I recommend that whenever you work with callbacks in an experimental fashion, you start this way, because that way it always cleans everything and then installs your new callback. Now, the way callbacks work is you attach a function binding. So there's messages is basically all the classes that will give you access to what messages basically these items send out. By the way, for, who was it? For Wobbly, who was saying, you know, I prefer a poll to callbacks. In many ways, this kind of is a poll because it only runs at idle time and not evaluation time. It will basically stash up, and then it will, during the idle, during the event loop after the idle has collected them, it will fire them off. Which also means that, like with any polling system, you have to be kind of careful because your poll might be, your pool might be in some odd orders at time. Anyway, so you have add attributes. So you have a lot. If you go for add, I have auto completion here, which is pretty convenient. You can see that you can actually add callbacks for a number of different things. So when you add an attribute, you can fire off a callback. You can register your callback so that when it's fired off, something happens. In this case, we want attribute change callback, which basically means whenever this attribute changes, whenever an attribute on this object changes, do something. So, and in here you pass it a function. You don't call a function, you pass it a function. So let's go for something super simple, CB. So I'm gonna create a function called CB here. Now what happens is when Maya gets to this point, it basically adds something to this node so that whenever any attribute changes, it will fire off a callback that says this is the object, and this is the function I want, and it will internally code this with a number of parameters. So I think in this case it will be the message, the plug that's been affected, the plug that plug might be talking to for some callbacks, and there's a payload that you can pass, or a status or something like that. So we don't care about it there, but that's basically what Maya is doing. It knows inside internally what plugs were touched and all of that, and it will pass them along. So when you implement the callback, you actually have to have the right arguments in here. You could also do the Python thing of going, you know, whatever args and KW args, and then inspect all the arguments. I find that you're better off like being fairly precise about it. So if in here you do something super simple, like print the message, you can see how many actions actually run in the my event loop. And like I don't know if it actually is obvious in the stream, but whenever you're in the channel box, there's a crap ton of stuff firing off. A ton. And if you change something, you will see different numbers coming through. Right? So I gotta stop it because this is getting kind of silly here. Now, and that's why I was saying, have something to remove all the callbacks when you're doing this stuff, because you can very quickly put yourself in a nasty place to sort. And this is just for some reason accumulated the message. If I scroll back through the history, you can see how many events were fired by doing nothing. So now that might seem crazy, might seem slow. It's not. It's actually, it happens at the right times. So in the documentation, you can find the number of constants. Message pump for the win. Yeah. It's on the edge. Like, we've done stuff at work that's pretty interesting. Remember that you implement this stuff, so you can make it stop and go however you want. This is Maya doing things blindly for you. You can regulate these things pretty well. There's constants that you can catch, and basically the message is what Maya is sending off, saying this is what happened to this attribute. It's changing this way, and it might have just been monitored, it might have been queried, it might have been whatever. Now, what we care about, and those constants are different. I don't know if you're getting bit masks somewhere and actual constants somewhere else, but I find that they're not always correct. So one way to do it is put these on a timer, look at the previous message, look if it was different, and only log new messages, so that as you do something, you go, okay, a new message has popped up. Now, in my case, I have just found out, I knew before, so I'm cheating, but I've just found out that this is what gets fired off when the actual attribute is changed. So I can go, if my message is of this type, then please let me know what plug that is. That is as simple as it gets. I might not get to go as far as I want to with this, but we'll pick it up the next time eventually. So at this point, you can see that I don't get as much spam as I was getting before, but when I manipulate something, and only when I manipulate something else, it's printing whatever plug is changing, which might be several, you know, if you change several at once, and it's gonna be everything in that object. So that gets us somewhere. Now, again, remember, like, if you don't have something that destroys all your callbacks that you can run pretty quickly, this is gonna get spammy very, very fast. So, okay, we got somewhere. Now, what we want is actually operate on just a bunch of plugs. So, I'm going to get myself another simple function. So, we only want to operate on transforms for this. Is plug interesting? Yeah. So yeah, I should be okay with this. Sorry, I was thinking about something. So we're only interested in a subset of plugs, and this will actually get us all the plugs. Now, if I want to get the object from a plug, that's pretty simple. You can go plug.node. If I want to find all the interesting plugs in that node that I consider interesting, you can get, actually I can use the dependency right away. MFN dependency node, and if you knew it was a dag node, you could use MFN dag node and restrict your cases, but we're not going to do that. So this is where we can go and get ourselves a list, I guess. Well, so we're interested in TX for sure. And this is where Emacs or Vim would actually be convenient, or Visual Studio with some plugins, extensions, whatever. So we're definitely interested in all translations, whether something happens to those or not, and in all rotations and in all scales. And I'm sure this is trilling, seeing me type this stuff. Now what I'm getting is just plug names. Then I can do interesting plugs equals, this is a list comprehension in Python. So I have the relevant node. This should work. I'm typing for a while without looking for things, but this should be all fairly trivial. Find plug each name for each name and p names. So that in theory should get me all the interesting plugs. No, I don't want to save it. Do I not want to save it? If we crash, we're gonna just cut it here. Anyway, so interesting plugs with there. So plug in interesting plugs, return true. Actually, we can do that. And for the sake of testing this, let's say that before we were responding to all of these, just for the sake of testing, we're gonna do something like that. If message is 2056, and this should actually have the right. Nope. I'm wondering if the scope is going to transfer, but I reckon it would. Invalid syntax somewhere. Oh yeah, of course. So now it should not be doing anything as I rotate, but it should be doing stuff as I translate. Apparently I have not caught all the plugs that I'm interested in. No, I am. Yeah. So it's not responding to these, or is it? It's responding to Z. No, it's responding to X in multiple instances. Anyway, so message pump for the win. And the other plug I might be interested in actually is if it's manipulating the compound one, will be translate, which is probably going to get called a fair bit. So this is going to blast away all my, yep, there you go. Object is incompatible with this method. And 13. Error in P names, my bad. Is this lowercase? Yeah. So when you manipulate across all three axes, it's calling the compound port. Yeah, translate should be lowercase. Yeah, you guys are probably not off the delay. And we're getting all the signals. Now, we will be doing the same for the rest. But anyway, if we only want to work on the translate, or we don't want to work on the rotation order because we're using matrices and so on, then we will limit the plugs to something like that. So we've done that. We've got a response to sorts. Now this is where things get a little bit hairy, I guess, but the other thing you want to do is get an no meaningful connection between objects. And I don't know how surprising this is going to be for some people. Like on YouTube, maybe on chat, I know quite a few people are actually fairly well acquainted with Maya. So in Maya you have something called message parts, and every node has a factory message part, and you can add however many you want. And the base idea of a message attribute is that they do nothing. They basically establish that nodes are connected for your pleasure and use, but they don't dirty the graph by default, they don't send out signals, they don't receive. So they're very useful when you want to establish some temporary connection of sorts. And because they have no effect, you can actually connect them to all kinds of stuff without actually sorting any effect. So they're output only by design, which is, well, at least the factory one, sorry, is output only by design, which is somewhat interesting because sometimes you just want to hook into something as input and you have to either add custom attributes or choose one that you know you're not going to use, but it's not a big drama. Pardon me, I hope you didn't hear that. You probably did. So what we want to do with this is basically, if we had a connection between two nodes and we were like an actual connection like the translates and we were implementing something to deal with that, this callback will probably be getting both plugs, this one, sorry, but in this case it's not. So we want to establish some sort of connection between the two that we can rely on. Now that means that if we want to find all nodes downstream of it, and so let's do something. Because we're working with plugs a lot, we probably want almost all of our function signatures to take a plug. So again, we want to do 1, 2, MFN dependency node, plug a node. Then we want to look for the message, which is, what am I doing here? And we are looking, it's going to be called just message, and you can rely on that being always there for you. It's like a good friend, except that it's kind of like one of the stoner friends. It doesn't do anything, but it's there for you. So we do have that plug. Then we want to look for receiving plugs, and let's do that. So for now, is this a, sorry, I'm looking at the doc real quick because I don't remember if this is a method. Yeah, this is a method, isn't it? I'm gonna roll the dice. Actually, we could even go destination nodes are gonna be other p.node for other p in message plug destinations, and they should get us the list of everything that's receiving. Let's see if that works. And that should now tell us whenever we do anything, if we've done our job. Oh, come on. I don't want to undock this. If we have done our job right, that should still printing that stuff. Oh, we're not returning anything. So yeah, we haven't done our job right. So yeah, so we now have all nodes that are connected there. And for, man, this is slow going. I hope this is still interesting enough. We want to return those. So if is plug interesting plug one, then get message connected nodes. Cool. So we want to get is plug interesting. So we actually want to return these. And then we go interesting plugs. So sure. Actually, we're using just translation, so we're gonna do translation plugs equals interesting plugs for our plug one, and they're gonna be source translation plugs. Now, so if actually we don't want to act at all unless we're in this message. We want to get these if there are interesting plugs. So if len source translation plugs, then in that case we want to go, and this is going to get us a list. So for, and it should be a list of M objects or HMob in message connected nodes of plug one. Then, well, sake of seeing if this works, we want to get the destination translation plugs. Which is gonna be, I should have like prepared these on and off screen. Like I can type it quickly enough, but it's probably, there's not a lot of values in watching me type compared to just looking at the script pre-made. I don't know. What is the chat thing? Should I have prepared these and just explained it, or live coding is better? So this gets me all the translation plugs in any affected nodes. Let's print it just for the sake of validating where we're at. So there you go. It's no attribute node. Potential randomizing question. How do you embed the callback to a rig? Once you register a callback, it's there. It's basically being registered to the object. So it will get delivered. It gets embedded with the object data, which is kind of why you have to manage them. You have to do stuff like that where you remove them, you manage them. You can query them fairly well for the object-based ones. The scene-based ones can get a little bit dodgy, and new scene will mess them up and so on. But if I remember right, they actually do, like if you export a cat down MA file with the right nodes, for people to import as a reference file, if you use referencing, then that's pretty much all you need. So line 11. I am passing something wrong here. Oh, interesting. Yeah, stupid. So find plug. I'm actually not interested in nodes as much as we can take a straighter route actually. So I was returning nodes here. I don't care for returning nodes. I can actually just return the plugs and that's it. So these might seem redundant. You could just return the destinations right away. Bear in mind, plugs are pretty volatile. So if you copy them, you are normally gonna be in a better place. So I would even say you probably want to hand over a fresh constructed one. That way it's less likely to get garbage collected. Sometimes you might even need to use copy. So games made right. Let me know if that answers your question. But yeah, they're pretty straightforward. They'll just deliver for you. It's if anything, the only issue with that is that you gotta be careful with what you get. So source translation plugs, that's cool. If it exists, then we have for, what am I doing here? I'm now losing myself. Okay, so for each test plug, so that should get me message connected nodes with plug one, should get me all the plugs on the other nodes downstream. So that should pass through this way. Yeah, it is. So the other question was like, so it's just a matter of making sure you're cleaning everything up before publishing. Yes. The Python code called by the callback will get saved with the scene. I am tempted to say yes. You gotta check for this because when and where I use them, both at home and at work, we have an entire pipeline with a bunch of stuff around them. And I might be lying. I'm not using them. I don't use them vanilla. I haven't used them vanilla for a long time. But it should be right. I mean, if we save and reload this scene, it will tell you. Otherwise, they used not to, or they used to have issues at one point, so people were bundling them with the nodes and then attaching a bunch of nodes for messages to a central repository and basically running an eval on the nodes of all those nodes to re-register them. But I think they do travel now. Don't take my word for it. Definitely check. So this should now work in theory. No, still not. Open my object. There's no attribute node. So what am I doing here? Okay, so if it's this message, then get all of these plugs, which should be cool. Then if they exist, so if there is a length, then for each destination plugin, connect the nodes. Interesting plugs. We'll take a plug. So let's actually still calling message connected. Ah, there you go. Thank you. Yep. Well spotted. I was calling a function that I renamed, so it was actually working, but it should not have had. So, unplug is not defined. Yes, it's not defined. That's true. ISO one namespace is alright. So we have a bunch of plugs that should be right. Per programming it works. There's a competition in chat apparently to see who spots my mistakes first. So let's actually, yeah, that's right. So down to MFN dependency node. hdexplug.node. Actually, we don't need. So that should be a singular plug dot name. And that might not work because it might be no, it's okay. So there you go. Every time I'm running it, it's telling me, okay, this is interesting. I got you, and I should have all the plugs I want to affect. We got a new sport, yeah. Pair coding, peer reviewing, peer reviewing, I don't know, competitive peer reviewing, something like that. So we're in a decent enough place now. Every time this gets manipulated in translation only, we know that we find this object and that we should have all the destination plugs that we are interested in. So in plug those destinations, and then we have its translation plugs. And I am actually gonna say that I don't care for the translate. Now, so we should be able to do. So these should be translation, destination plugin, that's translation plugs. These should be getting us each of the 4 plugs in that. Oh, I've registered it on the wrong object. So careful with your selection. We're working on selection here. I noticed just in time. Because the message plug does nothing, you're allowed loops. Yes, that's exactly it. Like you'll find plenty loops in Maya. Like Maya conflates tools and inspection and graph a lot. It's unclear whether the Maya's graph is an evaluation graph, a data graph. It's a little bit of all of that. And sometimes that's terrible, but sometimes it's pretty good. It lets you do a lot. So I'm getting the visibility, which is what I connected to. That is not what I wanted. I wanted the destination translation plugs. Because the message plug doesn't exist. Yeah, that's the one I was answering before. So we have interesting plugs. each desk plug. No, that's not what I want. There you go. I was like, that doesn't make sense. So these, again, you should probably make yourself a separate function that you can run just to blast away all callbacks so you don't have to do this thing. Yeah, somebody have found the type and right again. There you go. So now we actually have all the interesting plugs in the other one. Cool. Be tempted to go like, can we do it cyclically? Sure, I will try anyway. So that's interesting enough, I guess. Now we have the desk translation plugs. We should be able to do. So we know that those should all be floats. So values equals for the free values, we should be able to do p dot as float for p in desk translation plugs. No, we actually want the source translation plugs. Sure. And we actually want the one line down so we don't waste time. Like it's a Hail Mary, but it's a reliable Hail Mary because they're factory plugs that all of these will exist. So I'm actually gonna do a slice. And that is gonna go from, oh man, I always forget the Python syntax for slicing. So if it's inclusive, exclusive, invalid syntax. Yes, this does look invalid. 3p in this translation plugs, yes. Python callback fail, this translation plugs reference before assignment. Yeah, that will be an issue because I was actually missing. Yeah, luckily there's a lag in the stream, so people are catching up to my bugs. Like I'm fixing them before people catch them. So this is what we want. Let's see if people actually correct me on these as well. So okay, so we have the values that we want and we're getting them from the right ports and all of that. This is a win. That's cool. So what we want next, I'm doing this. So this is the thing in C++, you will just get the value of a plug because it has function overloading. So based on the type of the plug, you will know what to get. In Python, this is one of the first things you wrap, like get plug value, because you have to be very explicit about what value you expect, unless you do a lot of data wrapping, which you don't want to do. Well, you have to do it for matrices. But that's beside the point. So right now, and this is why I'm slicing. This is why I'm slicing from 1 to 4, because I don't want the translate, which is a compound, it's a triplet, to interfere. It also repeats the following 3 values. So I am also betting on the message connected plugs, the desk translation plugs to be, because they're factory attributes, to be interesting and of the same type. And I am betting on these not being values, but well, I am keeping these as plugs and not values. So in here, that's translation plugs. So this is message connected plugs, which should be at least per object, or rather it should, yeah. So let's try that. Nope. What am I doing here? And plug is no interesting plugs. What am I doing here? Up. Yeah, there you go again. I need to slice after the fact. All right, so I am getting my free plugs here. Now, are we in business? Let's see. So we have one of these. So we have a triplet of those plugs. And for each of them, we actually will want to get all of them and pump them into something following. So we want to keep them in sync. That means that well, I will normally map a function, but I don't want this to be even more unnecessarily syntactically complicated to read. So for am I using P? No, I'm gonna be lazy. For P in slice of plug. It's great because there's like the string delay is playing for me. I'm actually fixing things like shortly before people actually correct me in chat. So am I part of the game? Can I actually, if I fix them before you guys notice them within the string delay, am I actually winning that round? So for each plug in the destination translation plugs, I actually want the index as well. So I am gonna enumerate. And we're going like wildly over time. It's like at this point I've been streaming for almost 2 hours, but I kind of want to show this. I've been itching to do some scripting on stream for a while. I don't know. Somebody has to establish the rules. We need a codex. We need a proper rule book for this. So just to make sure I'm not doing something stupid, you know, printing is your friend. So they're in order as we expect them. Which, by the way, if you do this, you're fine. If you were to just walk the compound for translate. A compound is not guaranteed to return things in the order you will think they are. Be mindful of that. Your score is lazy evaluated mono. We don't. It's more or less than quacks like a duck. Yeah, no, you need a proper codex, right? And we can't wing this one. So this seems legit, which means that I should be able to do p.setFloat. I'm tempted to say. I'm sorry, I gotta check the doc on this one. I am tempted to say it is, yeah, set float. So I'm gonna do p set float from, we have the source translation plugs and we have the values. What a horrible name. But will this blend? I'm actually also gonna save these into a file because this is the point where you can start creating cycles, or you can hard set an object that is not ready to receive that value. So we'll see if it works out. There you go. What do you know? So what you're seeing there is, and like you can actually make this cyclic. Is basically not a live connection, so you're still free to move this one. Obviously, you know, if it's that simple, like this is gonna overwrite that value. But you could do things like introduce conditions and stuff like that in it, and break loops when they happen. So to break a benign cycle, you can set something, then something else sets it, and that's if you don't control that, you know, two things affect each other, they will loop forever. Oh, I made a boo-boo in removing my tablet. But there's a way to break benign cycles, which is actually how a lot of graphs do it, and I suspect that Maya's constraint cycles are actually broken that way. And so if you have a node A and you have a node B and you have that effect, you're cool, right? You have that effect, you're cool. Now, if you have something like that, oh, come on, I can do it. So, okay. Better. If you have something like that, now, if it's uncontrolled, that's an infinite loop. But if there is a value you're monitoring and you have a condition in there, right? So let's say that this has tx, ty, and tz, and this does too. And every cycle I can store those values because I'm not in a dumb graph. I'm in an actual script that has pretty good persistence and all of that. If every loop I check for the equality between those three items, whenever I find this to be true, I break. I literally, inside the script, you go break or return, whatever. That means that A will set B, and then B will set A, and then if this check is in A to B, or the other way around, doesn't matter, then the next time they will be found to be the same, and that cycle will stop. That callback will not run any longer. It has a predicate. So that's how you make a possible infinite loop into a benign cycle or a managed cycle. Now, hopefully that makes sense. That all does. Let me save that stuff in here. What we could actually do, if we want to be like really adventurous, first, and we might just hard crash in this because In this case, I don't remember. So here's another thing. Like the thing I like about callbacks like this is that normally OpenMaya 2, so this OM stuff, it doesn't automatically get onto the undo stack for you. But in the case of space switching, where the change in value will offset things into submission, in example, what happens is that when you undo the change value. So that change in value will fire the callback that should have the opposite effect to what it originally did. So when you have purely invertible callbacks, like space switching between two things, matching some object so that it's still in space, will basically not need an undo, because the simple undo of the attribute setting will fire off a callback that is the inverse of the previous one. Hopefully that makes sense. Even that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this way, space switching. Now, what I don't know, and we will find pretty quickly, is if I now connect these two in a cycle, and I register the same callback on both, they should be able to affect each other. What I don't know is if these affecting these will also fire this callback, and we get into that nasty loop. We are over. There's ask questions if you want. What I'm gonna do is see if Maya will crash on me or not for this. So I am gonna do the nasty and get myself a nice cycle. And sure, black box will do. It doesn't matter what attributes there are. But as you can see, like Maya doesn't even complain. I mean, I don't have the output window up, but it doesn't even complain about cycles or anything. SCGs don't create cycles. But if I first remove all these callbacks, so right, I'm about to run these stream delay and all. What does the chat think? Will this crash? Will fire, like, will values change by a callback fire off a following callback? What are the bets? I reckon they do. So I'm gonna wait for 5 seconds. With the stream delay and everything, you know, the answers are probably gonna be coming in when I actually fire this off. Gut says yes. All right, get your bets in. I'm running this. I say no. So, oh yes, they do. There you go. So yes, they will fire each other off. Anyway, welcome to our first infinite loop. Now that would have been pretty easy to solve. I just didn't want to spend, you know, we're 2 hours in at this point. I think it's been enough of a marathon. All I wanted to do with these is show you guys that they exist. You can do some very, very cool things with callbacks. And I know it's customary to rag on Maya, but honestly, the way the callbacks work, when they work, there's a few that are buggy, but over the years, there's been quite a big collection of them that has been built up. And I wonder, like, do I even get, like, is it completely freezing my box? Nah, it's actually been pretty well behaved in those regards. But yeah, Maya's going nuts. It's making pretty good use of memory. Like, it's barely climbing at all. I'm gonna kill it. But you can do some very, very cool things. And it's basically, when in your rigs, you find that the animators want something that is clearly cyclic. And that will happen all the time. People always want, like, oh, you know, I have the FK, and when I move the FK, you know, my cool stuff here, I want the IK to change, right? I'm sure, like, if you've rigged, you have heard that one before. And you go, all right, sure, I can make the IK a child of the FK if you want them to be working that way, or the other way around, and say, no, but when I move my IK, I actually want my FK to change. And it's like, well, do you realize that's a cycle? And it's like, yeah, sure, but it doesn't matter, because can't you write a script? Yes, it turns out you can. So this is basically how you will do a lot of that stuff. Are you going to stick that script in the show notes? That would be awesome. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I'll probably put it on the page on the website, so that it gets code formatting and everything, and people can have fun with it. All right, this is 2 hours in, which is, I don't know, do we call it a mega stream or something? But I was itching so bad to actually do a little bit of scripting. I mean, I've been going for like what, I don't know, 13 hours or something like that of like not writing a script on stream, not a single line of it. Hopefully this was useful. You know, the first half of the show, still vanilla Maya. You can just move stuff around and be happy with it. You get guides out of it. You know, we've wiggled a few things, but then there's a solid hour of me messing with stuff. All right, questions that I don't need Maya to answer because it's I've had to kill it. So super useful. Thank you for doing this. Out of curiosity, like how many people actually knew of the existence of callbacks and what they did? And there's a crap ton of them, and some are really good. You can monitor items being deleted from the scene. You can monitor like when an attribute is being added to the node, and they work per node, which is the good thing about it. You have to know what you're doing. You have to manage them carefully, but they are super important. So, need to catch up with the previous episodes to understand. Yeah, the rigging part, like the first half of it, without, I would say, the last stream and the 1-2 streams before might be tough. But hopefully the scripting parts do it on its own. So here's the thing, actually, this might be worth doing real quick. Maya's documentation, like, I don't know if Maya's documentation is good or not. I can't make a call for it. So do I find it useful? Yes. If you know, and this is ironic, but it's documentation. It's not a manual. It's not a tutorial, which is why, you know, streams like these or other tutorials or stuff like that exist. Great scarcity of stuff for OM2, sadly, and even less for C++, which is very close, but hopefully we'll remedy that. The documentation is not bad at all. It's not bad at all, but it's documentation. So if you, and here's the thing, there's two things about it. And depending on, you know, what your level of knowledge is, it might be good or not. Yeah, sure, that's gonna work. So here's the thing. Now, the 2017 one, this is downloaded, but it's a fine line, has pretty good options, right? And for myself, because of what I know of Maya and how I know it and all of that, 90% of the time, take off except words. I don't know why that's the default. It's crap. Ignore case is good. This is what I ran. This is the search I ran, which is search the C++ API reference, ignore the case, don't do exit words. And if I want something, I know what I'm looking for. And I want something for MFN dependency node. This is pretty good. Maya's documentation, like coverage-wise, is good. It's clear, it's complete. I think most of it is automatically generated. There's a ton of examples. Sadly, a lot of them are actually out of date. But there are. Like, there's more than you find for a lot of other things. And the layout of the API lends itself to this. There's, you know, I'm not saying it's great in every regard. I could spend days enumerating the faults of it. But somebody else could do the same about the API side, right? But it's not bad. So here's where I think it falls short of the mark. Now, you want Python API 2, which is what I was using. It's OM2, which is manually generated bindings for the C++ API, which is what makes them good. OM1 with Swig, which is automatically generated bindings. And I turn off the search C++ API reference. Now, what you get is far inferior, because what you get is the auto parse of what the bindings can assume. So already, and because of the way Python works, a lot of stuff makes less sense than it does in C++. Already I have less information. Some of the implementations are less complete. So you have to learn just enough of C++ to appreciate the documentation. And I'm talking about in terms of documentation, to be able to fall back to the C++ one. The Python 2.0, Python OpenMaya 2, whatever you want to call it, is good enough for you to know if something is implemented or not. 80% of the time it's actually, or even more once you get experience enough, it's good enough. And you've seen it. All I had was literally one page on my right monitor, and I didn't need to look at it that much. It's actually pretty right. but you need to be able to fall back to the C++ one. Now, if you want to learn from scratch, if you want some academic path of like learn these and learn these and learn these, no, it's terrible. If you want good examples of what's best, it's also terrible. The amount of figuring out, like there's some minefield out there. Maya has some really good beats and some really bad beats, and it's this minefield of really awesome and really crap, and the only way to find it is losing your legs to all the bad parts. So hopefully we're going to show some of the best practices and some of the cool beats and also some of the bad ones to absolutely avoid. But Callbacks is one of them. I don't know why they have a bad rep. They're actually pretty good beat to use. Script jobs, avoid them. They're the kind of landmines that takes away your legs and your friends. Sorry, that was a lot of soapboxing, but I had 3 minutes to fill. All right, somebody's saying that he's going to abandon the streams because they're going to get busy weekends. And I know they wake up at a ridiculous hour to follow them. So thanks for following me so far. So, you know, hopefully there will be more Euro streams in the future. SIGGRAPH is approaching fast. We'll see how season 1 actually pans out after that. I'm done with the soapboxing, but yeah. One of the questions was you got to go by the C++ API doc, right? To some extent, you want to be able to fall back to the C++ API doc, but I guess I've, you know, belabored that point enough at this point. All right, I am gonna call it here unless something pops up in literally the next 10 seconds. 15 seconds delay on the stream, so I'm giving you 15 seconds for something to pop up. I am counting Mississippis in my head. All right, I'm gonna call it. Thanks everybody for showing up to the stream. It's I love the streaming part, so the more people show up, you know, to all of you who have been showing up regularly, thanks a lot. You're the salt of the earth. If you're watching this on YouTube, I hope you found it 2 hours plus useful. My voice is really hoarse now. So I'm calling it. Thanks everybody again. See ya.